Good morning and welcome back to Conversations at the Corner and welcome to the month of July. Today is Wednesday, July the 2nd, and Pastor Nathan and I are back behind the black EIP microphones here for episode 26 at Conversations at the Corner. Pastor Nathan, how are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty good.
Good. Have you recovered from youth camp last month?
I have recovered from youth. We're recording this only a few days after youth camp, so I feel a little dead inside, but I'm sure by the time this episode airs, I will have recovered.
I hope so. If not, you probably should see a doctor.
Yeah.
But good. Well, welcome to Conversations at the Corner to our listeners. Today is July the 2nd. And Pastor Nathan, let's begin with a question of the day. Back over right after Easter, we got away for a couple of days and went down to Colonial Williamsburg and spent some time there in Yorktown where a lot of significant historical things happened for our country. And so that was a great trip and thought a lot about that. And my question to you today is, what American historical site would you like to visit? Maybe somewhere that either you've been there before or maybe you haven't been. It doesn't matter. But like when you think about historical sites in our country, where's somewhere you'd like to visit?
I think there's really two places. I haven't been to Philadelphia very much. I have a friend who lives there, and so I've been into like the neighborhoods and things like that, but I haven't been downtown to some of the historical sites. And the other thing that I think would be kind of cool to do is I would like to revisit Boston. So when I was in college, I was going to college in New Brunswick, Canada, and we had a fall break type thing, and it was a 20-hour drive back to home. So I didn't really want to go home, and I didn't really want to stay on campus either, but I didn't know what to do. So what I did was I called up a homeless shelter in Boston, and I didn't call them. I think I wrote them an email, and I said, hey, if I work for you guys 8 hours a day, will you give me a bed? Like, will you let me stay there? And then in the evenings, I can kind of do whatever I want to do. And so they said, sure. Yeah, okay, fine. So they put me up on the fourth floor with these like recovering heroin addicts, and I stayed there for a week. And it was kind of cool because it was near downtown, so I could go to like Boston Commons and do some things like that. But I think I was really at a point in my life where, one, I didn't have any money, and two, I didn't probably really know where I should go, but I did get to see some cool things. So I think it would be cool to go back as an adult and with more of a sense of purpose and knowing what I would actually look at.
Maybe stay in a hotel this time.
Yeah, maybe.
Things like that. Airbnb, I don't know. Something like that.
I don't think my kids would appreciate being at the homeless shelter. I don't know.
I don't
maybe
know
they
if your
would.
wife would either.
Yeah.
But I don't know. Maybe she would think that was a really cool thing.
Yeah, what about you?
That's good. I think there's a couple of places. I hadn't thought about Philadelphia. That's a great idea. Lots of course, historical things happened there. That would be a great thing. Plus, it would be cool. You could be there to study history and then run the Rocky Stairs while you're there. So that's kind of an extra.
That's more your thing. But yeah.
That's right. I think Gettysburg would be kind of cool. Yeah. But I mean, we're talking about a field in Pennsylvania. So I don't know really what there would be to see other than, this is where this battle took place. I don't know. We saw kind of a battlefield like that down in Yorktown. It's like, all right, there's this big open land. Like there's, I don't know. But I was going to go with Boston and like Plymouth and some of that stuff. That's what I was thinking. Yeah. So I'm with you. Maybe we can take that trip together. We'll do a staff trip up there and do some church planning and then do some historical stuff while we're there. So yeah, that's great. Pastor Nathan, we just came through a series entitled Stewardship is Lordship. And I spent the month of June preaching about this issue of lordship and that we can't settle the stewardship issue in our life until we settle lordship, and they kind of work hand in hand, and they're both vital to the Christian life. And so what we're doing in July is we have asked for questions from the congregation. Yeah. And so that's what we're going to do in July. But the ones we're going to tackle today actually go hand in hand with the series on stewardship that we just came out of. And so throughout the month, we're going to have different questions that you guys have submitted that we want to answer. So thank you for participating in that. But Pastor Nathan, why don't you take us into today's question? You're welcome to share who the question is sponsored by if you want. And then we'll get into the topic for today.
Yeah, so before I even get to the question itself, I do want to say that we received a number of questions. A lot of them were very good. There were a few that we got that we thought would fit better later on in the year, where one had to do with marriage and divorce, and we're going to be doing a series on marriage later this year. So we thought, well, we should put it there. So if your question isn't featured in this month of July, it might be featured down the line. So you could kind of look for it down the line. Right now, though, we have really a two-part question, and this comes from Sharon Zimmerman. So she had a lot of questions, actually. So we couldn't do all of the questions.
Some we will answer today, some we will not.
Some we will not. But she had a two-part question really on tithing. And so because we've been talking about stewardship, we thought this would be really good to put up front in the month of July. So here's the first part. And then I'll kind of throw it to you. And then I know we have some Bible passages we want to look at. But the first part of the question is, why is tithing, which is 10%, the word tithe just means 10%, considered a biblical mandate when it was an Old Testament law? The New Testament focuses more on generosity. So the question is, if the New Testament is focused so much on generosity, why do we still think about that 10%? That's an Old Testament law. So do you have any initial thoughts before we kind of bring out some?
I have lots of thoughts, but I'll let you start, and then I'll just jump in a little bit later. But why don't you go ahead and start with what you have?
Sure. So one of the things that I think we do, the first step that I kind of want to put out there is sometimes I think we misunderstand what is going on in the Old Testament. We have this idea that the Old Testament law is, well, there's this 10% and then that's it, and there's really nothing more going on. But in fact, there's quite a lot going on when it comes to tithing and giving throughout the law. This might be lost on us because as Bible readers, the law is not exciting. And so we might skim over. I'm sure that a lot of us are very guilty of skimming over it. I'm guilty of skimming over it quite a bit until I had to teach it. And then once I had to teach it, I was like, okay, I really need to dig into this a little bit more. But I want to start with where it starts, and that's in Genesis 14. This is Abraham is visiting with Melchizedek, and I'm just going to read it and then kind of go through a couple different passages here. So this is Genesis 14, starting in verse 18, if you want to pause and find it yourself. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High, and he blessed Abram, saying, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and praise to God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand." Then Abram gave him a tenth of everything. So Abraham had just been kind of fighting these little war skirmish things that are hard to follow in Genesis 13. And then he finishes that up and he has this encounter with this priest that's kind of weird, and we don't really know much about Melchizedek other than this. But the key I want to kind of hone in on here is that he gives a tenth of presumably his war spoils, is what would be my guess, to this priest, to his priest of God Most High. So it's an act of worship that Abraham has in response to winning these battles and encountering this priest. So that's kind of our start point. Okay. There's no command here. All right, this isn't a command. This is just a depiction. It's a story. This is what Abraham does. So the next thing we'll look at really quick is in everybody's favorite book, Leviticus. All right. I know y'all love that one. But we're going to be looking at Leviticus 27, 30 through 33. And again, if you want to pause and you want to find that yourself, that would be great. Otherwise, I'm just going to go ahead and read this. This is in the middle of a number of different laws about a variety of subjects. So a tithe of everything, so that is 10%. A tithe of everything from the land, whether grain from the soil or fruit from the trees, belongs to the Lord. It is holy to the Lord. Whoever would redeem any of their tithe must add a fifth of the value to it. Every tithe of the herd and flock, every 10th animal that passes under the shepherd's rod will be holy to the Lord. No one may pick out the good from the bad or make substitutions. If anyone does make a substitution, both the animal and its substitute become holy and cannot be redeemed. These are the commands, etc. So I want you to see that there's this command where a tithe or a tenth of the land. So this is in agricultural terms right now. Most of us do not own cows or fields or anything like that. Some of you might. But the idea here is that a tenth or the best of the best, it needs to go to the Lord. And there's even this provision where whoever would redeem any of their tithe, that means if anybody needs to almost hold it back, then they must add a fifth of the value to it. So like the way I'm reading this passage and my best understanding of it is, let's say you can't afford right now to give all 10% and you hold some of it back. Maybe you hold it back for a little while, but then you're going to add a fifth of the value to that. So you're going to have to pay more in the long run. It's almost like you're paying interest to God for a loan that you take out from him.
Making it up.
Yeah, you're making it up from him. Let's do a couple more really quick, and then we can maybe chat a bit here. This is from Numbers. Again, everybody's favorite book. Numbers 18:21. I'm not going to read as much of this one, but I give to the Levites all the tithes in Israel as their inheritance in return for the work they do while serving at the tent of meeting. So the Levites were this tribe in Israel. They were not supposed to go out and own a business or have a farm or whatever it was. They were dedicated to the work of the temple. And so that means they didn't have like a means of income. Who makes money from people coming and sacrificing animals? Not really. You don't make a lot of money from the work in the temple. It's not commerce in the way that we think of commerce. So God was saying that these tithes are to be given to the Levites. Okay, so it's to support them. It's to make sure that they have a means to live because they're doing this work that really doesn't earn money. Okay, let's jump finally to Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is kind of fun. It's more laws.
You've hit the trifecta today, haven't you?
I know. Just more laws.
Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy.
Yeah, the only one that we haven't done is Exodus. We haven't touched Exodus. So we've done all the other books of the law. But in Deuteronomy, in chapter 14, there's kind of a big section that I'm going to go ahead and read. I'm going to try to break down as quickly as I can just so you see what's going on with it. This is chapter 14, starting in verse 22. And we're going to go through verse 30. So this is a little bit of a longer section. And again, pause if you want to find it yourself and read it. Be sure to set aside a tenth of all your field's produce each year. Eat the tithe of your grain, new wine, and olive oil, and the firstborn of your herds and flocks in the presence of the Lord your God at the place he will choose as a dwelling for his name, so that you may learn to revere the Lord your God always. But if that place is too distant, and you have been blessed by the Lord your God and cannot carry your tithe, because the place where the Lord will choose to put his name is so far away, then exchange your tithe for silver, and take the silver with you and go to the place your Lord your God will choose. Use the silver to buy whatever you like, cattle, sheep, wine, or other fermented drink, or anything you wish. Then you and your household shall eat there in the presence of the Lord your God and rejoice. And do not neglect the Levites living in your towns, for they have no allotment or inheritance of their own. Now, my best understanding of this passage, you might read this passage and think, this is weird. You're supposed to set aside a tenth of your fields, but then you're supposed to eat it. We're like, what's going on here? My best understanding is that, so Deuteronomy is preparing the Israelites to enter into the promised land. And so what they're going to be doing is setting up festivals. There will be times when, for instance, we know in the New Testament that the Jewish people would come to Jerusalem for different festivals, Passover, right? Other different festivals throughout the year. So you would almost have like a religious vacation, if you will. That might be one way to kind of put it. So my best understanding of this is that there's a tithe that's set aside for the specific purpose of families going to these religious festivals. And that's why you get this whole, you don't want to carry your donkey or all this other stuff with you all the way to wherever I'm having you go. So turn it into silver, and then when you get there, then you can use that and do whatever you want with it, and I guess have your family vacation. So that's a little strange, and we don't hear a lot more about that in the Old Testament, but we want to see that there's another purpose for a tithe. And one last part of it, this is 28. At the end of every 3 years, bring all the tithes of that year's produce and store it in your towns, so that the Levites, who have no allotment or inheritance of their own, and the foreigners, the fatherless, and the widows who live in your towns may come and eat and be satisfied, and so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. So I wanted to bring that out because this is every 3 years. So not only do we have our regular tithes that we're doing, but every 3 years there's this special tithe that you bring and you set aside for the Levites again, but also for foreigners, for fatherless and widows, poor people who have needs that can't be met. So there's a specific provision that your tithe is not just strictly 10%. There's an above and beyond element to this as well. So I think that's what I want to bring out, is that when we read the Old Testament, sometimes we have this impression that, oh, they gave 10% and that was it. But God's commands to them really require quite a bit more generosity than just that 10%. So I'm out of breath almost. Let's stop there. Okay. I want to stop for a minute.
All right. You stop and catch your breath. Take a sip of water or whatever you want to do. Thank you for that historical background and all that. That is the starting point. The 10% is kind of the starting point of generosity, of giving back to God. That's kind of the baseline. And we've just gone through a bunch of Old Testament to kind of set the tone for where we're going, because the question was about related to the New Testament, because the New Testament doesn't necessarily use the word tithe. It does focus on giving and generosity, but we wanted to set that kind of the stage by going back to the Old Testament, and now we can get into the New Testament.
And one key is that the New Testament does not require us to keep every bit of the law that we read. We are required, of course, to keep the moral code, but we're not required to keep the dietary laws. I had shrimp the other day. Gladly, right?
So, dare you.
So the idea here is that this might be a part of the law that isn't strictly required. And of course, we don't live in Israel anymore. So some of these things don't apply.
Or do they?
Or do they? I don't know. Let's see. What do you have to say?
Well, I want to get into the New Testament part. I don't really have anything to add to the Old Testament part. I appreciate you setting the stage, giving the background, and even expanding on not just the basic tithe, but those special tithes as well. But as we get into the New Testament, what are some of the passages? I've got a couple, but why don't you start with the ones that you have, and then we'll talk about those. And then I think I have a couple different ones that I can add to it as well. So when we get into the New Testament, what do you think about tithing and giving and generosity? And more importantly, what does God's word say?
Yeah, I mean, the New Testament. So let's do this. I want to start with just one point. So this is Jesus speaking to the Pharisees in Matthew 23:23. And so what he says, this is in the midst of, he's kind of getting on their case about a whole lot of different things. What he does, he says, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give 1/10 of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. You blind guides, you strain out a gnat but swallow a camel." So Jesus' point here is that these teachers of the law and the Pharisees, they're being very strict in their tithe. They're taking even their spices, and they're like, okay, we're going to get 1/10 of our cumin, and we're going to do this. And we're going to make sure we have everything lined up. And he's saying, yeah, but you guys you don't love mercy, you don't love justice. There's all these other bigger things that you should be focusing on. And what he says is, not that you shouldn't have given your tithe and focused on justice and mercy. You should have done both, right? So Jesus affirms the tithe. Maybe, now we're in the New Testament era, so maybe we don't have to think strictly about what's going on in the Old Testament, but Jesus affirms the idea that we should be setting aside an amount.
And he mentioned, didn't he say 1/10? You give 1/10 of your spices.
Yeah.
So
you give 1/10 of your spices.
Yeah. That baseline of a tithe or 1/10, he mentions it here in Matthew 23.
So the other element that I want to bring out is that when we read, especially in the letters, in Paul's letters, there's more of an emphasis on generosity. Paul doesn't speak directly about the tithe really, but there is an emphasis on generosity. And I think what I want to highlight here, and this is the only thing I want to highlight, it comes from 2 Corinthians 9:7. So again, if you want to pause and turn to that, you can. But I want to give the context of 2 Corinthians because sometimes we pull a passage like this out of context. We don't really know what's going on. Here's the passage. Each of you should give what you have decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. Okay, great. Yeah, that makes sense. Generosity. You should be giving what your heart has decided to give. Don't be reluctant about it. Don't begrudge it. Be cheerful. We are generous people. Well, what's interesting is that 2 Corinthians is basically a glorified fundraising letter. Okay. Not all of it, but a good chunk of it. Paul is trying to collect a gift to send to the church in Jerusalem. They've recently had a famine, and so he really wants to support them. And so he's going around to a number of different churches. We see hints of this in Philippians and a couple of other letters. So he's writing these Corinthians to say, hey, I really want you to give. And so there's a little bit of an irony here, not under compulsion, except the Apostle Paul is writing you to tell you to give something.
And when the Apostle Paul asks you or tells you to give, you better do it.
Yeah. So, but I think embedded in this is this idea that the gift to the church in Jerusalem was a special thing. It wasn't necessarily a normal giving thing. A circumstance had come up in Jerusalem. They had this famine, so there was a need. And so it was like, hey, let's find a way to meet this need. Paul wants to support them, and he's kind of doing the logistics, admin element and telling them to give.
So let me ask you this. Would that be similar to, Emmanuel is part of the Shenandoah District, so we have other Wesleyan churches at Virginia, West Virginia. Would that be similar to like if the DS sent out a request to all the churches and said, hey, this church that's a part of our family experienced some hard times. Their church flooded, they had a fire, whatever. Let's, as a family, come together and give to them. Would that be the same kind of thought and principle?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
It's just above and beyond, not the normal giving that we would give.
And it's for another church.
For another church and for an extreme circumstance.
Yep.
Right? That's not normal. Most churches don't flood all the time.
That's right. Except for ours on Christmas Eve a couple years ago. You missed that.
I did.
I'm over it, though. I promise. I am.
It sure sounds like you.
I know. Thank you for sharing that. I have a couple others that I want to mention. I also had Matthew 23:23 written down. I have Luke 11:42, which I think is Luke's version of Matthew 23. It says basically the same thing.
Yeah.
Luke chapter 20, verse 25, Jesus is talking, and I'm not going to read that whole passage, but this is where he says, then give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God's what is God's.
Right.
And so even, we're talking about paying taxes or whatever, but give your tax, but also don't forget to give God's what is due to him.
Yeah.
This is I have one here in 1 Corinthians. I'll maybe get to, but I want to focus on this one in Matthew chapter 5, verses 17 through 20. I came across this actually not long ago. I think when I was prepping for this series on stewardship, actually. But this is what it says. Jesus said, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. And so I think that Jesus is saying, I'm not doing away with all of those things. I'm fulfilling many of them, but let's not forget these fundamental things.
Yeah, I think as a basic interpretation, that's right. So Jesus is going to say things like, well, the law is summed up with love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Well, those come from the Old Testament. That's not something that he just made up. So yeah, the underlying principles of the law still apply. Now, we might not be giving money to the Levites right now because we don't live in Israel and we don't have a tribe that services the tabernacle or the temple.
Yep.
So that's really not as applicable anymore, but the basic principle can still carry over.
Right. Yep. Let me read this one, 1 Corinthians 16, and then I want to just share something that I didn't put on my notes for today, but goes back to something you said. So let me start with this. 1 Corinthians 16, Verses 1 and 2. Now about the collection for the Lord's people, do what I told the Galatian churches to do. On the first day of every week, each one of you should set aside a sum of money in keeping with your income, saving it up so that when I come, no collections will have to be made.
Yeah.
So I don't have like deep insights into that, but there is another example of setting this aside, doing this regularly.
Yep.
And being a part of our act of worship.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because the way that Paul describes that is as a discipline. Mm-hmm. It's not just something that out of the blue, it's saying every week, do this. And so there's a regularity to it.
Yep.
There's this is what we do every week. Mm-hmm. And it's not really any more than that.
Yeah. Let me add one more thing, and then I'm going to be quiet and then kind of let you put any kind of closing thoughts you have before we wrap up on this. But in Genesis 14, you were reading and you talked about Melchizedek was mentioned in that. In Hebrews chapter 7, this is one that I chose not to read, but I'm going to mention it because of what you read. This is the passage where it talks about Jesus being a high priest.
Yep.
Like Melchizedek and all that.
Yep.
And so there are tithing references and giving references in different parts of Hebrews chapter 7 that ties back to Genesis 14, something that you read earlier.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, and I don't have that in front of me, so I don't feel like I could probably comment on it much at all.
Yeah.
Off the cuff. But one thing I would say is that there might be some different views on precisely how a disciplined tithe should be set aside or what it should be set aside for.
Okay.
In the Old Testament, we have very specific provisions, the Levites. Mm-hmm. Here on this one, you're setting it aside for the foreigners and the fatherless and the widow and that sort of thing. Whereas in the New Testament, we don't have as much direction on how a tithe should be set or for whom and what purpose a regular tithe should be set aside. Now, we presume that the church is similar to the Levites. You and me, we don't, pastors, churches, we don't provide a service that makes a profit, right? So we don't have widgets that we sell, right? We don't live in a mansion or anything like that.
No.
Right? So the idea is that in order for us to do what we do, in order for the church to function and to live and grow and all the things, you want lights on in your sanctuary, we need to have money coming in from somewhere, and it's not the sale of any particular good. So we kind of look at it as the church is like analogous or the same as the Levites. Like, so most people, when you think of a tithe, you're giving that 10% to your local church, presumably. Now, I do think there might be some differences where some people might give a portion, maybe they give 7 or 8% to their local church, and then maybe some of the rest of their tithe they support some Kids for Compassion International or whatever. There's lots of different great parachurch organizations out there. What I would say is this, or what I would say pastorally is work to get that 10%. That's your baseline, and then wherever opportunity comes up, and you can give more, then be generous and give more. That's what we want to do. We want to be a people who give and to sacrifice.
Yeah. And, sometimes we don't necessarily say this all the time, but when we come to that portion of our worship service where we remind people to give, we haven't really passed the plates any since COVID happened.
Right.
I wouldn't mind getting back to that, but we've just gotten so used to not passing the plates that we haven't done that. But that was for tithes and offerings.
Right.
And so an offering would be anything separate above the tithe. So you would give, for instance, your 10% to tithe, just the general fund in the church, where you entrust the church leaders to divvy that up and use it wisely and as good stewards and all of that.
Yeah.
But then you may give an offering above 10%. So let's say your tithe is $500 for the week or for the month or whatever. You give your tithe of $500, but then you say, oh, I want to give some toward a missionary or a building project or something, and you may stroke another check for another $100 or $150 or $200
or whatever,
and that would be above and beyond the 10% tithe. That would be considered an offering.
Right.
It would go above that for a different purpose.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, I probably wouldn't get too technical about those types of things. I do think the principle is generosity. We want to be a generous people. I think baseline, when you're budgeting, if you're at home and you're working out your family budget, we automatically set aside the 10%, not as a law that comes from the Old Testament per se, but as just a foundation for our giving. Mm-hmm. We do want our giving to be disciplined, just like Paul kind of said in Galatians. Every week, do this discipline, set something aside. And so I think that works just as a foundation for your giving.
Yep. And just as a reminder to our listeners, when Pastor Nathan was talking about you doing your family budget 10%, if we're going to do it biblically, that's the first 10%. It's the first fruit. So it's not the leftover 10% or the middle. That should be really the first money that you give when you get paid. I know we have a joke in our house on payday. Samantha will get up that morning and pay our tithe right away. And the joke is, if you forget to pay it and I go to Starbucks, like we're cursed for the next 2 weeks because you didn't pay our tithe first. Obviously,
okay, guys, that's not an official theological.
I just said that was a joke in our house. Yeah. But the thought of you do this first. Now, if that's hey, I'm going to pay the tithe and she forgets and I run and do something like that, I don't think God's going to go, man, you really blew it there. No. But that is what we try to do. The first fruits, the first money that is given after you get paid should be your tithe check.
Right. And for some people that's different. We give online, and so it doesn't even register as a first fruits thing. It's just like it comes out of our bank account.
Oh, you have it set to just do it automatically?
Yeah, we have it set to just automatically do it. So I don't even really think about it. Now, maybe that's bad. Maybe I should think about it, but that's what we do.
Yeah. Hey, you're paying it. That's what matters. Thank you. As your pastor and your boss, I say thank you very much for that. All right. I think we have one more question. I know our time is getting lengthy on this, so I think we have one other question. I'll read the question. Yep. And then, Pastor Nathan, I'll let you take first crack at it. Does this question also come from Sharon? Okay.
Yep, Sharon.
All right. Here's the question. This is also related to the tithe. What if a person is a model Christian in every way, but they do not tithe? Will they get into heaven? Well, I think we can do this pretty quickly. I'll let you take first crack.
The answer to that is I don't know. Like one of the ways that we think we were kind of talking about this question the other day, and the way that I kind of said it is this. Well, what if you have a model Christian in every other way? Okay, they do a lot of great things, but they're like a kleptomaniac. I don't know. Okay, they steal a lot, and they really struggle with stealing. Yeah, right. Yeah. Are they getting into heaven? I don't know. I mean, that's something that I sort of feel like God is going to have to deal with. What do they really understand about their sin? Are they struggling with it, or are they just giving into it and doing whatever they want? Or are they really actively trying to fight against it and maybe sometimes losing? I don't know. I'm not here to be the judge. The only thing I will say is that I do think generosity and giving is required of us. So how God judges, I don't know. Yeah.
But all right, very quickly, I'll answer this, and then I'll let you put any closing thoughts on this if you want. What if the person is a model Christian every way, but they do not tithe? I would say if they do not tithe, they are not a model Christian. So I would say that is part of it. So if you are not tithing as a part of your Christian walk, you are not a model Christian. The second part, will they get into heaven? I would say that tithing is not a matter, it is not a salvation issue. However, I would say it is an obedience issue. Yeah. And as we have talked about, that it's not just about saying that he is Lord with our lips, but it's saying he's Lord with our life. And so it's a lordship issue. It's an obedience issue. Jesus said, not everybody who says, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. So it requires obedience. Now, is not paying your tithe going to keep you out of heaven? I'm like you. I'm not going to say yes or no. I don't know. Yeah. I would tend to say, I don't think so, but I don't know. I don't know accountability and what you know and what you don't know and all those kind of things. So I'm not going to tell you, you get a free pass to be willfully disobedient to God on this. I'm not going to do that.
No. And look, Paul answers that question. Should we sin more so that grace should increase more? Yeah. He says certainly
Absolutely not.
So like if you need to give, then give. Yep. That's what we should be doing.
Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's what I would really put that as kind of my summary thought here is that we are saved, of course, not by works, but we are saved out of faith, which is connected to obedience. It's connected to this idea that we are loyal, that we are devoted to God, and that doesn't just get to be, we're devoted to God in this way, which is easy and I like, but it's also we're devoted to God in ways that are difficult. And sometimes tithing is not easy. Some of us don't want to tithe because we want to keep our money. Some of us might struggle financially, and so a tithe is hard. But I think just that basic acting and doing is a part of our faith and our devotion to Jesus.
Partial obedience is not obedience at all. It's all or nothing. So tithing began in the Old Testament, continues through the New Testament, and it is a continued biblical principle today. So thank you for those questions, Sharon. Hopefully that was an answer for you and others that maybe had similar thoughts on that. Those of you that are tithing, thank you very much for giving to our church, or if you are part of another church and you're tithing, on behalf of your pastor and leadership team, I know they would want me to thank you for your obedience to that. If that's something that you struggle with, I would encourage you to really work through that. It is a matter of obedience, and God doesn't need you or me. This is what he asks of us. His work will be done with or without us, but our lives will be different and marked by obedience. So I would encourage you in that. Pastor Nathan, before I pray, do you have anything else?
I'm good.
Okay, let's pray. Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for this time that we could talk about this very important issue of tithing and generosity and giving. God, we give because you first gave to us. So thank you for being a generous God who has given and continues to give so freely to us, and most of all by giving your Son. So God, help us to make giving back to you, returning to you what is already yours. Help us to make that a priority. And Lord, I pray that you would help us to find joy in doing that. But God, may we be an obedient of people, even in this area of finances and stewardship in our life. God, bless those who are doing this. God, convict those who are not. And may your work continue to go forward through the obedience of your people. We praise you and thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you so much for joining us today. Conversations at the Corner, same time, same channel next week. Keep rolling, Emmanuel.